I'm here to talk about Modern Cures. If we can pull up the first slide. Modern Cures was introduced by Congressman Lance, has about 50 co-sponsors. The National Health Council is an umbrella organization of patient advocacy organizations. Our mission is to provide a united voice for people with chronic disease and disabilities. We have more than 50 leading patient advocacy organizations in membership. We were created in 1920. And while we allow all stakeholders into membership at the National Health Council, our governance is controlled by the CEOs of the patient advocacy organizations. We can jump to the next slide. This is really what is the basis with the legislation I want to tell you about. Now, it's very hard to see this slide, but what you can see are the colors that are ramping up from left to right. That's the investment in the development of new treatments for people with chronic conditions. And over a 10-year period, you saw that investment double, not just at the NIH, but in the private sector and the not-for-profit sector. And in fact, the patient advocacy community provides more than $1 billion every year to the development of new treatments. The line that you see zigzagging across that 10-year period represents the approvals of new treatments. And what you see is, despite that doubling, the new treatments coming out at the end has remained largely stagnant. Now, there were a lot of reasons for that, but it woke the patient advocacy community up about 6 years to say, we can't just focus on funding for basic research. We've got to look at the entire life cycle of the development of treatments. And we have to figure out, what are the barriers? What are the wallpaper that has been hung that's creating the difficulties for developing new treatments? And so the chief medical officers of the patient advocacy community asked the National Health Council to look at what were the challenges here to the development of new treatments. Where were the opportunities to fix some of the barriers, to get the treatments that we all looked? And so we actually did an environmental scan, a literature review. We interviewed members of Congress, the FDA, NIH. We went to Europe, we went to Asia. We tried to identify what were those problems and what were the ones that we could solve. And I have to tell you that we do not solve all of the problems. There are a lot of challenges to the development of new treatments, but this bill solves 4 very important challenges. So if we can go to the next slide. The first challenge it solves is related to the driving force behind the development of new medicines. And that is that medicines are really predicated on having a strong patent. And I think most people in the room probably know that if you're going to develop a medicine, you have to have a patent to protect it. But there are a couple of challenges with that. First challenge is that many products that could potentially prove to be incredible medicines, in particular for rare disease, don't qualify for patents. Now think about that for a second. When you look at the investment at NIH, as much as 80% of it results in great ideas for the development of treatments that don't have patents. When you speak with pharmaceutical companies, they'll tell you when they look at a new medicine and are going to make the decision as to whether or not they're going to develop and commercialize it, they're going to look at the science, but they're also going to look at the strength of the patent. And if the patent is not strong, they're not going to develop that medicine. And many companies will tell you as much as 80 to 90% of the no-go decision in that first round is not predicated on the science, it's predicated on the lack of a patent. From a patient perspective, this is crazy, ugly wallpaper. It makes no sense. If the science is there, we should be developing the medicine, not simply relying on the strength of the patent. A related issue that shifted about 20 plus years ago is that your patent runs concurrently with the development of your medicine. Now, that doesn't sound so bad, but when you start to look at developing a medicine for a rare disease, something that may take a long time to try and figure out the mechanisms of action and how to get that medicine to market, it may take 15 plus years, especially if that disease progresses very slow and you need to show whether or not the medicine is actually safe and effective. What that does is it puts the incentive, the premium, on a medicine that takes a very short period of time. And so what you see are companies looking at existing medicines and how can they tweak them, get a new patent, and then have 20 years of protection for a short period of time. It sort of has created a disincentive for these more difficult to develop medicines. And in fact, you're seeing a lot of companies actually move away from these difficult areas. Shire being one great exception to this rule. But you see many companies actually pulling out of what they call the brain space, or the autoimmune space, or the neurologic space, or rare disease, simply because the time to bring that medicine to market is going to mean that there's such a short period to market it on the back end that you can't develop it. In this picture, you see two twins, the Hempel twins. They have a rare disease called Niemann-Pick. This disease is essentially like Alzheimer's for children. It usually manifests itself by the time you're 4 or 5, and for many kids, by the time you're 8 or 9, it can actually take your life. You lose your cognitive function, your ability to walk, your ability to speak. The parents of these children, who are not researchers or drug developers, are actually producing a medicine that has had remarkable success for their children. It's keeping them alive. They're actually walking again, and they're actually seeing some restoration in cognitive function. They've actually had the drug approved as a rare disease, as an orphan drug at the FDA. They're developing it. They have it now in their own clinical trial. This medicine has huge implications for Alzheimer's. It also has huge implications for heart disease. Nobody will invest in the development of this product because it doesn't have a patent. And we see countless products. In fact, NIH recently said that there are as many as 30,000 compounds that they're aware of that they think could prove very useful to address unmet medical need, but are not being developed because they don't have patents. Think about that. We need to develop the best science that can produce the best medicines for people with unmet medical needs. So Modern Cures sets the clock at the point of approval, and it gives you a patent substitute. It says you can produce that medicine. It doesn't matter how long it takes to develop and produce that and get it approved. Once it's approved, you can bring it to market and protect it from generic competition for a period of time, essentially roughly equal had you had a strong patent. It allows the generic to follow to the market, but it allows the science, not the patent law, to produce the medicines. It's a huge opportunity to make sure that the best compounds get developed, not the ones with the strongest patents. If we can go to the next slide, please. In addition to developing these medicines, which is critically important, we want to promote personalized medicine. We want to promote the development of diagnostics that help ensure that a product, when you take it, is actually going to work for you. Now, a lot of people in the rare disease community will sit back and say, well, is that important to me? I would say the answer is absolutely yes. And the reason for that is, in many instances, medicines work in only a small percentage of the population with that disease, or of the people who have that disease. And if that population is too small and there are side effects, you run into challenges with the product ever reaching the market, even though it could work incredibly well for a subset. A great example is the new product for CF. It works for a subset of the population, somewhere around 3 to 5%. If you could not identify that population, that medicine would likely never come to market. A real challenge. If you look in this picture, this is Richard. He has lung cancer. He's had one of his lungs removed. He's had tumors in his brain, throughout his body, and not too long ago started finding tumors in his remaining lung. He was essentially at the end of his life, and as it turns out, a medicine that treats about 3% of the population actually works for him. It was approved because there was a diagnostic that helps identify which population it works for. The challenge is that we have only a handful of these diagnostics. About 3 years ago, there were only about 30. This last year, we're upwards around 70. For people with chronic conditions, in fact, the general public, we assumed that we had much more precise medicine. We also assumed that when we took medicines, that they worked for us. And yet the average is only 60 to 65% of people respond to a medicine. If you start to look at oncology or rare disease, those numbers can slip to about 10%. It's a real challenge to incentivize the development of these kinds of diagnostics. They're sort of like turkey on Thanksgiving. You get the turkey really cheap so that you go into the supermarket to buy the other stuff. The diagnostics have become our lost leader. Our challenge is, how do we promote the development of these diagnostics? So in this case, what we do in the bill is we say to a pharmaceutical company or biologic company, if you will develop a diagnostic that accurately predicts whether or not a medicine will work safely and effectively for you, we'll extend the period of protection against generic competition by 6 months to a year. That 6 months to a year, the economists tell us, will double or triple the investment in the development of diagnostics for people with chronic conditions. A huge investment. Doesn't mean we'll get double or triple the number of diagnostics, but it means we will invest a substantial amount of money into the development of these resources that will more precisely predict whether or not a medicine works for you. We can go to the next slide. The third barrier really has to deal with the fact that if you develop a diagnostic, it's very difficult to get a code, and you need a code for a doctor to order the diagnostic and be reimbursed for it. Perhaps the best known diagnostic, if we can go to the next slide, is the HER2 breast cancer test. And it's very hard to see this slide, but what you can see is it took a long time to develop this test. But once it was approved by FDA, it took nearly 5 years to get a code. So let me explain what that meant to people with breast cancer. It meant that there was a medicine you could take that had huge side effect profile, was quite expensive to the system, had expensive out-of-pocket costs, but if you had the right gene expression, it meant that it could greatly reduce the recurrence of breast cancer. For nearly 5 years, some women had to roll the dice. Some of them took the medicine and didn't need it. A lot of women didn't take the medicine and had a recurrence of breast cancer, simply because we waited 5 years to get a code for a doctor to order this. Now, there's some good reasons why the coding process takes as long as it does for an innovative diagnostic like this, but there's no reason to deny somebody access. The solution in Modern Cures is to provide a temporary code for that specific diagnostic once it's approved by the FDA, so that a doctor can order it and somebody can actually benefit from the diagnostic. Next slide. The last issue has to do, again, with these diagnostics and their reimbursement. I won't go into great detail, but I'll tell you that the reimbursement of these advanced diagnostics was frozen in time in 1984. It was a cost containment mechanism. But you have to think back to 1984 and the kind of diagnostics we had. They were far more simpler than what we have now. They were much easier to produce. They're not the kind of examples like the HER2 breast cancer that we're talking about. How do you promote the development of those when they're going to be reimbursed for pennies on the investment? So an advanced diagnostic might get reimbursed at a couple of dollars because it is referenced back to what existed in 1984. It makes no sense, and so we have this challenge where it's hard to get these innovative tools through the FDA. It's hard to get a code. And then once you do that, you're going to get reimbursed a very small amount. And we wonder why we only have 30 to 70 of these advanced diagnostics. What Modern Cures does is it says to the secretary, you can consider the benefit to the individual patient of this diagnostic. You can consider the benefit to society as a whole by getting the right medicine to the right person at the right time when you decide your reimbursement. It doesn't mandate that you change reimbursement for all diagnostics, but it allows the secretary to consider the factors that would be important in the treatment of the individual's care and start to provide the incentive to develop these diagnostics. We can go to the last slide, please. I'm just going to stop there and say that this bill starts to strip away some of the wallpaper, the innovation wallpaper that has been built up over the last 30 years that we need to remove if we're going to develop the kind of treatments we all want. These are not things that anybody did intentionally to try and stop the development of new treatments, but they are impediments that exist now that we can fix and start to achieve a ecosystem where the development of treatments for rare disease and others start to get developed.